As these cars get older, you may start to experience hesitation under acceleration, misfires that a simple spark plug and wire change won't fix, or even a no start problem. This may be the coils getting weak internally, even if they're not arcing outside the coil packs themselves. It's recommended to replace the ignition coils and the PTU at the same time. These cars are at the youngest over 20 years old now and produce a ton of heat underneath in the engine bay. So even if the coils don't look bad, they can still potentially be failing. Today, I'm going to go through a step-by-step process on replacing the ignition coils, the PTU, spark plug and wires, and I'm going to put a idle air control valve on this car just for good measure, since it's well over 20 years old now.
Alright, let's start by removing the battery. There's usually a tie down right here with a J hook that goes down here. And you take the two 10s, we'll take this 10 off. There's a 10 that you loosen over here, unhook the J hook, and you can pull it out. On my new factory battery harness, these are 10s, but usually people replace them with some from part stores or anything like that, so then they become half inch or whatever size the aftermarket ones are. Start with negative first. Get it out the way. Then remove the positive. Next, we're going to remove the Y pipe. Usually these are 10s, but this is aftermarket Y pipe. They could have different clamps on them, anything like that. So we're just going to get this out the way. The hose for the blow-off valve, usually a 10, not this time. These could be a pain to take off sometimes because of all the heat and the age of the piping. So you take some pliers, grip it as loosely as you can, but still gripping it, and twist back and forth until it starts moving. And then pull it off. These two are 10s. Just loosen them. And same thing with the blow-off valve hose. You may need to convince them to come off, but not that time. So I'm going to take it, and just set it out the way. This has this reference for the boost controller, so we're going to leave that on just so I don't break it, and set it on the side. There's a 10 for this clamp, and we'll pull that pipe off. You can leave this in here and just move it out the way as you work. You need to unplug the mass airflow sensor. Be careful with the clip because it likes to break. Ten here, 10 here, and this hose. Take this hose off from the valve cover. It's least likely to break anything. And just twist and pull, and it'll work itself off. Some of these mass airflow sensors, or these air filters, come with a bracket that holds this in place, so we need to take it off. Alright, so we'll take this out as an assembly. You have to avoid the blow-off valve hose, and there's also a reference on the blow-off valve. Alright, so we don't have to take this pipe off, we're going to leave that there. We're also going to leave this on, but we're going to push it back out of the way. Next, we need to disconnect. Let's see if I can get in there. This is for the ignition coil and the little condenser. We need to unplug those, and we could get to the two connectors on the PTU, which are right here and right here. Need to be careful disconnecting these because the clips can break. So we're just going to reach underneath here, unplug the ignition coils. This condenser is a little tricky. You may need a pick or something to pull up on the clip. And disconnect one of the PTU plugs. Make sure you pull on the connectors and not the wires, because the wires can pull out. The other PTU plug is kind of like an injector connector where they have these metal clips you need to pull back. And be careful not to lose them into oblivion because they like to fly off. Now that all the connectors are pulled off, we're going to go ahead and pull off the plug wires. we'll just go ahead and remove these now because they're kind of in the way. So to get the coil off, you have this 12 right here, a 12 right here that's kind of difficult to get to. You have to go behind here, and then the final 12. This first bolt right here is a little longer. I'm going to use a ratchet with a long deep 12 on it. Same for this other bolt. And those are the two bolts that we just removed in the same position. So the intercooler pipe and the engine bracket coil pack bolt. So now we're gonna go ahead and wiggle it out. There's also sometimes a 10 right there, depending on if your car was worked on before or not. It's a little harder to get to. It's right here. With the coil pack removed, we can see the PTU better. We need to remove this 10 right here that holds vacuum hoses that go from each side of the motor. After the bolt's removed, just you can kind of bend it out of the way a little bit with a little bit of effort. We need to get to that 12 right there. Below the water housing. I pulled the wires for the coolant temp sensors. With the lower radiator hose still on, it makes it kind of a pain to get to it. But with a deep 12 and extension, you get to it. So there's a 10 that's in about the middle underneath the PTU. I'm going to use this deep 12. I have a reducer because I don't have a 3/8 12 here with a 1-inch extension. And that fits just about like that. Alright, so now that 10 that you just took out has a little bracket for the coolant line. You're going to come forward with the PTU, flip that bracket up, pull it up. That's the 10 and the 12. The 10 and the 12. Alright, let's take this new PTU, put it into position. Flip that bracket back up and it'll kind of hold it. And now we need to start the 12 and the 10 by hand. That one's finger tight. Now you have to line up the bracket in the hole to get this other 10 in, which will be more difficult. So this bottom bolt, you have to have a little patience, but you could eventually get it in there with your fingers blind to where you eventually get a socket on it and start threading it in. Tighten up the bolts. Pull this line back over. Plug in the coolant connectors. And the PTU. You're going to need to transfer the condenser over. Go ahead and wiggle this back into place. And start finger tightening the bolts. Tighten up the bolts. Plug in the coils and the condenser. And the hardest part is done. Okay, next I'm going to change this idle air control valve. Since it's so old and they're known to take the ECU out when they fail, I'm going to go ahead and replace it. It's just two 8mm, one right here and one underneath where you can't see too good, but it isn't that hard to get to. Go ahead and take the 10 out of this fuel line holder to get it out the way. Make sure that the O-ring comes out with it. You can see the O-ring still inside. I'm going to replace that. There's a receiving groove that the O-ring slots into. That's the new O-ring installed. And we're going to go ahead and install the new idle air control valve. Tighten the bolts. Be careful not to over tighten it, as this new one is plastic. Let's get it nice and snug. Next we're going to remove the intake plenum. This really isn't that bad. We're going to start by removing these two bolts for the throttle cable, taking the throttle cable out, moving this 12 and this 12 for the intercooler pipe to the rear turbo, and we're just going to set it aside. Now that the throttle cable and the intercooler pipe's out of the way, you have a good bit more room to work with. You're going to want to take this bracket bolt out, this bracket bolt out, and this one over here on the throttle body. If your car still has EGR, you can leave this EGR valve on, but you're going to have to disconnect vacuum lines that go to it. This plate, however, will have a tube that goes here to here. You just undo these two. The tube has a little bit of play. You can leave these two back in. Just be mindful of the gasket. Alright, here's a better view of behind the intake manifold, the bolts you'll need to get to remove it. Right here, right here, and there's one on the throttle body. You also have the EGR pipe if you still have it on your car, and the EGR can stay on when you pull off the intake. Whenever you reassemble, you're going to want to put the intake back on, threading these bolts hand tight, then tighten the intake before you tighten these. If you do it reverse, you'll more than likely never get these back in. These are all 12s back here. They should be 12s. If you don't have a throttle body gasket, don't take this off. 9 times out of 10, the gasket's going to break. I do have a gasket, so I'm going to take it off. However, if you don't have one, just go ahead and flip the intake up. Be mindful of the coolant lines, and you can just hold it to the shock with a long bungee cord. That'll give you enough room to change the spark plugs and do whatever you need to do back there. Go ahead and take the throttle position sensor off. and the 4 bolts for the throttle body. If your car is 100% stock, you're still going to have vacuum lines you're going to need to take off, but this one doesn't. Now that the throttle body is out of the way, we'll go ahead and take the vacuum lines off. Two bolts for these connectors, 2 bolts for the injector wiring cover. We got 5 long bolts for the intake plenum, and a nut on each side. This one's supposed to be a nut. Go ahead and use some pliers to pull off these clamps. Twist and pull. Twist and pull. I'm gonna need to cut the zip tie probably. Nope. Let's do the 10s. Just move this harness off. This one you're gonna have to kind of pull out your way while you're working. And do the 12s. Be careful with these nuts. Alright, this next thing is extremely important. When you pull the intake off, make sure there's nothing about to fall in. And you may want to cover the open intake ports with a rag so that nothing falls into the cylinders. Alright, so make sure you cover this. Something flat over the top, or a big rag that you won't forget about and get sucked into the cylinder. But now we're back here and we can access all these plugs. Alright, let's go ahead and remove the spark plugs. Before we go throwing these spark plugs in, we need to check the gap on them. I believe the stock gap is about 0.040. $40,000. But this car is running a little bit more boost, so I'm probably going to gap down to 34 thousandths. Go ahead and do that for all 6. There's a proper torque setting for spark plugs, but the general rule of thumb is hand tight plus a half to 2/3 of a turn, which will also have the torque setting and that value on the back of the NGK box. The easy way to put the wires back on is first we need to figure out which number is cylinder 1. So at the front of the engine, which is right here, look for the closest to you injector or intake port, or the furthest cylinder or the closest cylinder to you. So this is number 1, since the injector is closer to you than number 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's also numbers on the coil pack bracket. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Next we measure out the wires. The shortest one is here. Longest. Two. We have two that are about the same length. We put both of those here and there. There and there. And put some grease around before I snap them in. Cylinder 1. Cylinder 3. And cylinder 5. Cylinder 2. Cylinder 4. And and cylinder 6. Replacing this gasket after making sure the surfaces are flat and clean. This throttle body gasket goes on a certain way. Look at the impressions versus the holes. Tighten the throttle body bolts in a star pattern. Or crisscross. Go ahead and reinstall the stay bolts or the bracket bolts behind it, hand tight. You may need to lift the intake up just a little bit in the back to get them started. This one goes through the turbo feed line bracket. Now tighten the Plenum main bolts in a star pattern. Be careful not to strip out the lower intake. Tighten the stay bolts. Reconnect throttle position sensor and idle air control valve. Reinstall the 10s for the injector bracket. And this wiring bracket here. Reinstall the vacuum lines. Reinstall the rear intake tube. Replace this O-ring if necessary. Reinstall the throttle cable. You want to pull the throttle cable until you see it. You just start to pull on the throttle body and then back off a little bit. Make sure you have the ground somewhere on the engine, on the block somewhere, on the intake. Reinstall the mass airflow sensor, making sure to reinstall the blow off or bypass valve reference. Remember to connect this crankcase hose. Tighten up these two. Plug in the mass airflow sensor. Install the filter. Reinstall this intercooler tube. This one's clamp fell down, which is not a big deal. You have to squeeze your arm into the abyss and pull it back out. Put the spark plug cover back on. Reinstall the Y pipe. Make sure you put the bypass valve hose on and get the clamp if it fell down. Tighten all the clamps. and reinstall your battery.